The conversation around Sabrina Carpenter's new album cover is really illustrative of a couple of huge issues going on in society right now. The first is that almost all art is entirely spineless, and art has been so heavily commercialized and commodified that people are willing to accept the bare fucking minimum and weave an entire narrative around it to suit the depth that they are so desperate for. It doesn't mean that it's in there in the art. The second is that most people simply do not have the range to have these conversations because everyone wants to have a take, everyone wants to be a part of the conversation. No one actually wants to do the research, to do the learning, to acknowledge the history that has come before all of this. And so most takes around everything are flattened into a contextless, ahistorical Jubilee soundbite that means nothing. I want to have a real conversation about this because too often conversations like this are led by people whose top priority is getting a snarky tweet that pops off that makes them feel smarter than everyone else. And I think that a lot of this conversation is also hindered by our societal need to kind of censor ourselves in reaction to existing on algorithms and on the internet platforms. I don't censor myself. So I don't know how far a video like this is capable of going because I use words like pornography. I think it's important to use those words and not substitute them for things that are easier and more palatable. I think that part of the reason why we're in this predicament as a society right now is because our need to censor ourselves has bled into our actual belief system. I'm also not going to waste time talking about the extremists on either side of this issue. I'm not going to waste time talking about people who are genuinely sex negative or who believe that pornography is inherently harmful. Now, the porn industry is absolutely harmful, and I do think that porn as a whole has been contributive to a lot of net negatives, especially for women in society, but I also think that there's more nuance to that conversation. I think that as a generation, the youth of today is generally more sex negative than my generation, for example, but these things are cyclical, okay? So I don't think that this is an issue of pointing fingers or trying to be dismissive of youth culture. I think that this is a pervasive issue, and I think it goes hand in hand with not only the rise of trad wives, but also as we've seen on this app, the rise of things like bimbo feminism and this sprinkle ideology that men ain't shit, you should never trust a man, and you inherently have to treat dating like some kind of 1950s socioeconomic business relationship. I think that all of these things are dehumanizing. I think that all of these things are a direct result of the hyper-individualism that we express as a culture now because everybody thinks they're the one fucking exception, and that's not the case. And again, I feel like this Sabrina Carpenter album cover, people are like, she's the exception, okay? Can't a girl just be sexy? Can't a girl just like sex? Sure she can. But I'm not going to ignore the entire historical precedence that has gotten us here to this moment. And I'm also, I talk about this when it comes to Marvel movies too. When people talk about how important representation is in Marvel movies. I'm not saying it's not important, but I'm also saying we have come to accept such spineless, fucking nothing art. We have come to accept art that doubles as a fucking supergroup sunscreen commercial. And we're trying to attach some kind of really significant meaning to that. We used to have artists like Sinead O'Connor, like Fiona Apple, like the entire Riot Girl movement that spoke out and had principles that were outside of the products they were trying to fucking sell you, okay? And I think that people need to be really aware when they try to attach some kind of significant meaning to an artist like Sabrina Carpenter, who I have nothing against, and I think that she's adorable and a talented artist. I don't listen to a ton of pop music, especially not current pop music, but I'm not offended by her art, and I don't think that her album cover is inherently offensively terrible in and of itself. I think it's no more or less harmful than any given Maxim magazine spread from the early 2000s. And that's actually the element of all this that I find the most disturbing as someone who lived through this in the 2000s, is that I'm seeing the same patterns arise, okay? When I see women in particular saying, well, you just wouldn't get it. What do you like? God, what are you, a Puritan? You're so anti-sex. This kind of belittling of the way that young women are reacting to a piece of art at the end of the day, that's what it is, reminds me so much of the rise of pick-me culture and the cool girl. And as much as I love the Spice Girls, for example, they were part of a corporate takedown of actual feminist movement that started happening in the early 2000s and the late 90s. The third wave of feminism, yes, embraced sexuality, yes, embraced individualism, and to an extent, intersectionality. Obviously, we had a lot of work to do at that point, but the Charlie's Angels reboot, the hyper pop sexuality that was being shoved down our throats in the name of girl power was a distraction. It was a corporate product that they could commodify this trend and then sell back to us that also prevented prevented the actual progress from being made, while also conveniently reinforcing our inherent value as sexual objects. And I am not saying that like hyperpop femininity is automatically bad, but I don't think we as a society are nearly good enough at recognizing when it's being weaponized against us. Every time women like start to become too aware of the power that we hold, there is a very intentional course correct made by the powers that be to shove this kind of like embracing of sexuality, hyperpop femininity, empowerment down our throats. And I think it's bullshit. And I think that it's an insult to my intelligence to assume that I'm not smart enough to see it. And it's especially infuriating to have people telling me that I just don't get it. What's to fucking get about that image? Genuinely. There was actually a photo shoot that I wanted to include in this video, but I realized when I was looking up the images for it again that it probably was too salacious for TikTok. You can look it up if you want to. It's a Lindsay Lohan photo shoot from GQ in 2006. Now, you should know going in that this was the peak of the time when the tabloids and the American media were absolutely devouring Lindsay Lohan. She had had so many scandals by this point. She had tried to have a comeback. I believe at this point she'd been in and out of rehab at least once or twice. It was a really rough time for her. And so the subversive concept for this magazine shoot was Lindsay Lohan splayed across a bed in explicitly sexual positions over top of her own tabloid clippings. There's even a couple of images where she's looking directly at the camera while she lights them on fire. Now, this is supposed to be empowering, right? It's subversive. It's self-aware. She knows exactly what she's doing. She's aware. It's a commentary on how the camera is there to consume her. And so she's aware of it. It's a commentary on it. It's ironic, isn't it? Except, what's the fucking point of that? What is still the takeaway? At the end of the day, she's still performing sexuality with the express end goal of every other time she had ever done it at that point. Being self-aware adds nothing to the context of that. And that's the thing. That's the thing that was the problem in the 2000s, is no matter how self-aware we were of our own exploitation, internalized misogyny was higher than it had ever been, because just because we were putting a name to it didn't mean that the problems did not still exist and did not cause so much problem amongst young women. That's kind of the core thesis for this book, which I just finished reading, which is amazing. It's called Girl on Girl, How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Women Against Themselves by Sophie Gilbert. She is a Pulitzer Prize finalist writer, and she is fucking fantastic. This book wove together a lot of threads for me as someone who, again, lived through the early 2000s, because she ties a lot of the way mainstream culture evolved to the rise of pornography, specifically the rise of violent pornography, and the rise of porn stars like Sasha Grey, who normalized that kind of like crying, choking, hair pulling kind of thing, which again, if you look at the Sabrina Carpenter image, it co-opts the direct imagery of pornography. And again, I'm not saying pornography is the devil, but I do think that kind of like teetering on abuse form of pornography has been so normalized, and that's one of the reasons why I think this particular image is so triggering to women. Like, I'm sorry, but trying to draw parallels between this image of Sabrina Carpenter's and Madonna's work with her sex book, with Madonna's erotica, with the advocacy that she did in the 80s for the queer community during the AIDS crisis, before even most politicians would even touch it, is laughable. It's laughable to my intelligence, and it's laughable because it so clearly ignores any and all historical precedents. We live in a time when every single pop star that has come up in the last literal decade has stripped down to perform in one way or another. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying that I have anything against seeing the female form publicly. I think it's, I think we've done it since the dawn of time. But it's not subversive or bold or daring to be sex positive as a pop star in 2025. It just simply is not. And what Madonna was doing in the early 90s was daring to suggest that women's pleasure mattered, which was subversive back then, 30 years ago. And look, I obviously wasn't looking for Sabrina Carpenter to be some kind of feminist messiah. I don't think anyone was. I think she's honestly the least important element of this conversation, because this is just one example in a much larger systemic problem. But this discourse has been really illuminating in highlighting how commonplace and popular it's become to belittle young women's rightful reactions to the ways that they are seeing themselves represented in media. And I think it's very reminiscent of the way that in the 2000s, this hypersexual pop feminism was used to quash out any real change or discussion. And I also don't think it's a coincidence that this discourse was designed to happen when there's much more important things going on in the world to trivialize it and keep the discourse going.